Hello, welcome back. We are in chapter 22 of Leviticus, and I shaved my beard if you didn't notice. And if you're not watching, never mind. You may not even know I had a beard. Uh, this chapter is really about the way the priests handle things. And I've said this on a couple of occasions. We are the priest in the kingdom of God. So, why do we need to know these things? Because these are the expectations God has of us. Now, you don't need to go to the temple, you don't need to do sacrifices, but the expectation to protect His holiness is still a requirement for us. It is our job to fulfill that duty as best we can. And we do that by learning His Word, being obedient to His commands and His laws, and learning more about what He wants us to do on a daily basis. That's the key. So, this is Leviticus chapter 22. There's not a whole lot of difference in the translation, so uh, I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. I know it's a little easier to understand, so we'll jump right in. Chapter 22 of Leviticus. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons to be very careful with the sacred gifts that the Israelites set apart for me, so they do not bring shame on my holy name. I am the Lord. Give them the following instructions. In all future generations," that's us, "if any of your descendants is ceremonially unclean when he approaches the sacred offerings that the people of Israel consecrate to the Lord, he must be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. If any of Aaron's descendants have a skin disease or any kind of discharge that makes them ceremonially unclean, he may not eat from the sacred offerings until he has been pronounced clean. He also becomes unclean by touching a corpse or by having an emission of semen, or by touching a small animal that is unclean, or by touching someone who is ceremonially unclean for any reason. The man who is defiled in any of these ways will remain unclean until evening. He may not eat from the sacred offerings unless he has bathed himself in water. When the sun goes down, he will be ceremonially clean again and may eat from the sacred offerings, for this is his food. He may not eat an animal that has died of natural death or has been torn apart by wild animals, for this would defile him. I am the Lord. The priest must follow my instructions carefully, otherwise they will be punished for their sin and will die for violating my instructions. I am the Lord who makes them holy. No one outside a priest's family may eat the sacred offerings. Even guests and hired workers in a priest's home are not allowed to eat them. However, if the priest buys a slave for himself, the slave may eat from the sacred offerings. And if his slaves have children, they may also share his food. If a priest's daughter marries someone outside the priestly family, she may no longer eat the sacred offerings. But if she becomes a widow or is divorced and has no children to support her, and she returns to live in her father's home as in her youth, she may eat her father's food again. Otherwise, no one outside a priest's family may eat the sacred offerings. Any such person who eats the sacred offerings without realizing it must pay the priest for the amount eaten, plus an additional 20%. The priest must not let the Israelites defile the sacred offerings brought to the Lord by allowing unauthorized people to eat them. This would bring guilt upon them and require them to pay compensation. I am the Lord who makes them holy. And the Lord said to Moses, "Give Aaron and his sons and all the Israelites these instructions, which apply to both native Israelites and the foreigners living among them. If you present a gift as a burnt offering to the Lord, whether it is to fulfill a vow or as a voluntary offering, you will be accepted only if your offering is a male animal with no defects. It may be a bull, a ram, or a male goat. Do not present an animal with defects, because the Lord will not accept it on your behalf. If you present a peace offering to the Lord from the herd or the flock, whether it is to fulfill a vow or as a voluntary offering, you must offer a perfect animal. It may have no defect of any kind. You must not offer an animal that is blind, crippled, or injured, or that has a wart, a skin sore, or scab. Such animals must never be offered on the altar as special gifts to the Lord. If a bull or a lamb has a leg that is too long or too short, it may be offered as a voluntary offering, but it may not be offered to fulfill a vow. If an animal has damaged testicles or is castrated, you may not offer it to the Lord. You must never do this in your own land, and you must not accept such an animal from foreigners and then offer it as a sacrifice to your God. Such animals will not be accepted on your behalf, for they are mutilated or defective. And the Lord said to Moses, when a calf or a lamb or a goat is born, it must be left with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day on, it will be acceptable as a special gift to the Lord. But you must not slaughter a mother animal and her offspring on the same day, whether from the herd or the flock. When you bring a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, sacrifice it properly so you will be accepted. Eat the entire sacrificed animal on the day it's presented. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. I am the Lord. You must faithfully keep all my commands by putting them into practice, for I am the Lord. Do not bring shame on my holy name, for I will display my holiness among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who makes you holy. It was I who rescued you from the land of Egypt, that I might be your God. I am the Lord. So that's pretty straightforward. Essentially, God says, do it my way. I don't want you to do it your way. I don't want you to compromise. I don't want you to logically figure out a better way to do it. I want you to do it my way. And so that's why he said what he said. So this chapter is really about the priest who may not officiate sacrifices or eat food brought as sacrifices. A priest is disqualified if he's in a state of impurity, and most require like an 8-day cycle of cleansing. But verse 6 says that this person shall remain unclean till evening or till sunset, basically. What gives? Why that change there? Well, the first situation is a priest who did something that is prohibited. The second is a situation where a priest is touching someone who was made unclean. So direct defilement requires the 8-day cycle of purification. Indirect defilement requires waiting until sundown and then a ritual bath. And remember, we talked about the logical way of thinking is figuring out the reasons and then making it make sense. But we're not going to find those answers in the Bible. That's the basic question of why. This is more of a way of learning the patterns and the principles of God and how he laid that out, not necessarily why. He doesn't tell us why on a lot of things. So verse 10 says that no outsider may eat of the sacred offerings. We get 5 categories of people who could be living with the priest. A lay person, a bound or tenant laborer, essentially kind of a paying off a debt in some way, a hired laborer, an employee basically, a priest purchased slave, and a person born in the household. So these classes are not well defined, and it's understood by the writer, though, that we already know the details of every category. Because remember, they weren't writing to me and you, they were writing to fellow Israelites who were supposedly brought up in the Old Testament, understood all of these things and the culture as a whole. So they had no thought that somebody like me would be sitting several thousand miles away reading these words. So they didn't go into every detail to explain everything. It's kind of like I've said before, like, saying I let the cat out of the bag. People who have no reference to that, why was the cat in the bag? And, what's the purpose of that? These are things that were known in that culture. So the first category is simply that no non-priest is permitted to eat the food of the sacred offerings and donations. The second category in Hebrew is tashav, and it can mean guest worker, a foreign friend to the family kind of thing. The third category is sakir, and it means a hired laborer, basically an employee. They have a job and they're paid for it. The fourth category means to acquire a living being. It's usually a foreign slave because Hebrews could not own other Hebrews. And this category is considered family and permitted to eat the sacred offering. Slaves were not, basically a foreign slave was really just an employee. They were not treated horribly or anything like that. They were not bound with chains or anything like that. So a purchased slave is considered a family but it's a slave paying off a debt. And um, I'm sorry, a purchased slave is considered family, but a slave paying off a debt was not family. They were basically uh, just someone who owed this person money and they were working it off. So they were not treated as, they weren't treated bad, but they weren't treated as family members. They were here working off a debt. And this definition is really important as we go through the rest of the Bible because we owe a debt and that debt's been paid by Jesus, Yeshua. So the final category in Hebrew is Yeled Bieto, and it is children born of purchased slaves. The children born from purchased slaves belong to the slave owner. So even though this kind of hurts our sensibilities about things now, and I'm not saying it's right or anything like that, I'm just saying the reality of it is a purchased slave, anything produced by that purchased slave, if they built something, went and got something, or produced children, those were the slave owner's property. That's just the way it was at the time. So this only pertains to whether or not they are entitled to eat the sacred food portion. That's all that means. It doesn't mean they were starved. It just means could they eat the sacred portion that was for the priest. So verses 13 through 15 deal with someone unqualified eating sacred food. And these rules apply when it's an unintentional error. I accidentally did. I didn't realize that's what it was. Never can someone ignore Jehovah's holiness and be given a complete pass. That's not in the Bible anywhere, and we should never forget that. We can't just go, I don't think God cares about that anymore. Even though we do it all the time, we shouldn't do that. And we're never given a complete pass to that. We will have to answer for that. So verse 16 says, "For it is I, Jehovah, who make them sacred." What is being addressed here is the pagan belief that you can make yourself holy by doing certain things. That was huge in pagan religions. It still is today. I can work my way into holiness. And one of the things you could do was to eat the food of the gods that were sacrificed, and that would make you holy. That's what they believed. That wasn't true, but that was the thought process in some of these pagan religions. So God was telling Israel, He makes them holy. No other possibility of you being holy unless He determines it. He makes that decision. You can't sacrifice your way to holiness. You can't obey the laws enough to obtain holiness. You can't eat your way to holiness. It's His determination only. So you can only be declared holy by Jehovah Himself. You have to be redeemed by God, then declared holy by God. Then, out of gratitude, you follow Him in obedience. That's the way the process works. You have been made holy and righteous. Now go and live a holy and righteous life. He's already made that determination if we've accepted the work of His Son, Yeshua, the Messiah. So the first group of offerings are based on the Olah sacrifices, and the second group is based on the Shelamim. And we covered those in the earlier chapters. So if you didn't catch that video, run back to that one and check those out, and they'll make a little bit more sense. Yeshua followed this pattern. He had to be the blemish-free sacrifice, which came from the tribe of Judah, and he had to be the perfect priest of a certain type, the Melchizedek, rather than the order of Aaron. Because remember, Aaron was the high priest and the family of all, but he wasn't a perfect high priest. So that's where Yeshua fulfilled that pattern. He didn't end it, he filled it up with meaning. So it doesn't matter if the source is Hebrew or Gentile, perfection is still the same requirement. If the requirement is to be acceptable to God, it is the same for all. Do you believe that the rules and ordinance that define good and evil, clean and unclean, just and unjust, are different for different groups? If you don't, then you're like most of the modern church. They think there's completely different rules for us as there are for the Hebrews. But if you believe the whole Bible is the complete revelation of God, then all the rules are the same for everybody. So the Torah defines righteousness and holiness for everyone. There's not another definition somewhere. and it defines life and goodness for all. God doesn't say, Hebrews, you have to be very strict and follow my Torah, but Gentiles, just make it up as you go along. Do a good job with it. That's not true. It's not in the Bible anywhere. So all these requirements of Leviticus are brought forward to the New Testament, which is why you need the Old Testament to understand the full meaning of the New Testament. In 1 Peter 2:9, it says this, but you are a chosen people, the king's Kohanim, high priest, a holy nation, a people for God to possess. Why? In order for you to declare the praises of the one who called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. So as a believer, you are a priest. The only way to be a priest is a believer. That's it. So in Luke 14:26, it says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life besides, he cannot be my talmid. And that is just my follower, my disciple. Nothing can be above God is what he's saying there. And then in Matthew 8:21, it says, another of the Talmudim said to him, sir, first let me go and bury my father. But Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, replied, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Priests ordained by Jesus are to emulate the priest of Israel. Why would we have a whole new system that he didn't even put in the Bible if he didn't want us to follow that Bible? I mean, just as the temple priest could not deal with dead things, neither are believers. We're not supposed to be around that kind of stuff. So Yeshua is raising the Torah rules to their full spiritual purposes. The examples of Torah are physical demonstrations of spiritual principles. This is not saying that believers shouldn't participate in funerals. It's saying that we shouldn't link ourselves up to dead things. Don't spend time there. And again, there's no temple, there's no sacrifices. Yeshua is still the only way to heaven. This is talking about how to live once you're redeemed, once you're saved. How are you supposed to approach things? And it's not about making it up as we go along, and it's not about what some pastor says. It's about what God says in his word. It is drawing the distinction really between those who will forsake all to follow Yeshua versus those who stick to tradition. And believe me, I understand people like to stick to tradition. They do not want to be told something is not biblical. It may not be wrong, but it's not biblical. And when you start down that road, people get really upset. My goal is to get us to learn the biblical word, the true word of God, and follow it as best we can. We don't need a temple to do that. We are the temple, and Yeshua the Messiah is the way. So that's chapter 22. Next week, or I guess next time, we'll get into Leviticus 23. God bless, love God, love people, and change the world.